Hello, today we are going to look at chapter 34. This chapter takes us into the process of decolonization. Now, I talked a little bit about decolonization in the World War II chapter. At the end of the chapter, we talked about some of the nations, formerly colonized nations, that led independence movements. And you'll remember that one of the reasons so many nations became independent after World War II was in part because of the Atlantic Charter signed by Churchill and FDR that agreed to the right of people everywhere to choose their own government. This set in motion the process for Britain to relinquish its territories after the war. But another reason was because people in many of these colonized states decided that it was time to take advantage of the weaknesses in Europe, the fact that Europe was just coming out of its own major war. They also felt empowered because during the war years they had been able to sustain themselves, they had fought alongside their colonized, their mother countries, and they had also seen weaknesses in their European mother countries that they felt could be could basically be taken advantage of in their own fights for independence. So on this map, you see the colonies, the areas of the world that were colonized, and it's color-coded according to the various countries that took over. You'll notice a lot of, in the light purple, British colonies, and Japan here took over Korea, Taiwan, and then of course we know they took over more of this region during the war but had to relinquish it afterwards. So this map gives you a pretty good idea, and it also, if you can look, I know it's hard to see from where you're sitting, but if you're able to take a look at it online, you can see the years on which each country gained its independence. Most of the independence movements are going to happen in the 1950s, and independence will be achieved throughout the 1960s. And this is a fun map that I just happened across online. This shows every country that England has ever invaded. Pretty interesting. So what are some of the challenges that newly decolonized nations face? In the chapter on World War II, which was chapter 31, we talked about the process of decolonization, how it tended to be more violent in the settler colonies and more peaceful in the colonies where there were already large populations of natives and smaller populations of white settlers. So by the 1960s, most of these colonies have achieved independence, but that does not make them into these utopian societies that are now just basking in the glow of independence. The reality of decolonization is that you have countries who have for a long time been reliant on an industrial power. They have primarily served as a producer for raw materials and not really developed very much manufacturing. Now, we did talk about during the war years there would have been some manufacturing going on, but it was pretty small compared to what you see in the Western countries. Definitely much smaller than necessary to have a stable, mixed, diverse economy. You have undeveloped economies, oftentimes meaning that they rely on one product. And as we've talked about in the past, relying on one thing makes you a very unstable economy. It makes you very susceptible to the ebbs and flows of demands in other parts of the world. And a single problem like a bad disease in your crops can basically destroy your entire country's economy. A lot of the newly decolonized nations face environmental troubles as they are urbanizing very quickly Deforestation is going to cause problems. You also don't have a lot of education. You don't have a lot of experience in running governments, in running companies. There's going to be a lack of resources, very inexperienced leaders as well. So overall, what you see in most nations is not a utopia, but a very weak and unstable situation. Overall, there's not enough wealth to go around. Rivalries are often created because, as we've talked about in the past, the borders that had been drawn by European colonizers did not take into consideration different ethnic groups. Europeans had combined hostile ethnic groups and often played one another off of each other. They use this. Rwanda is a great example of the Europeans using two hostile ethnic groups, putting one in power and having the majority basically being oppressed. And then when the Europeans left, the tables turned and it resulted in genocide. The rivalries often develop into internal battles, civil wars that are going to further drain the nations of resources and hamper their growth. In some cases, there will be new nations created out of these. For example, Bangladesh will be created a few years after India and Pakistan are created. Bangladesh will be carved out of the northeastern part of India and created as a result of rivalries between the Indians and the Bangladeshis. Here's an ethnic map of Africa. A little bit older, but it basically tries to take into consideration all of the different ethnic groups, all of the tribal groups throughout Africa, and you can see there's a lot. So making every one of these ethnic groups into its own self-sustaining nation is going to be pretty impossible. But what I want you to notice is how all of these different groups are crammed together. In some countries, like the Congo here, contain many different people groups, many different tribal groups, all with slightly different values, customs, and you can understand why Africa still continues to be a hotbed of conflict. Colonized nations are going to see massive population growth. And this population growth really started prior to decolonization. Population growth started when the West began industrializing, taking over colonies, and as Western countries took over colonies, they introduced things like medicines, new agricultural techniques, things that promoted population growth. But while the countries were colonies, oftentimes the Western powers provided job opportunities, and the demand from the West and the basically intervention of Western technology, Western industry, Western economy allowed the colonies to sustain that population growth without major issues of famine and the like. The problem is this population growth continues once nations become independent, and at that point you lose a lot of your leadership structure. You lose much of the production. Some of the trade will definitely go down. So you're going to have very populous countries with a lot of people out of work. You're going to have issues of famine and poverty as a result. Here's a graph that shows you the drastic growth in population, and it really shows you population growth over the last 500 years. Notice that for most of human history, population rates have stayed pretty consistent. When it starts to grow, the human population starts to grow with industrialization. Now you'll notice that Western Europe and the United States, even though their populations have grown since industrialization, they're not quite as drastic as nations like China, India, Africa, or regions, I'm sorry, like China, India, Africa, and Latin America. And part of the reason for that is cultural differences and differences in understanding of family and childbearing and the accessibility of birth control, which we'll talk more about in a second. Here's another map that shows you pretty much the same thing. The darker regions represent the regions with the highest rate of population growth. The lighter regions represent the areas with the lowest rates of population growth. You'll notice that in Eastern Europe and Russia, we have pretty low population growth rates. The United States actually isn't that low, but most of our population is growing due to immigration, not necessarily due to new births. The Indian population is going to soar after the decolonization process ends, and actually it had begun to grow even before that. The AIDS epidemic in Africa will prevent the same rate of growth in Africa. However, you will definitely have a growing population despite the many deaths due to AIDS. There are some significant barriers to population control in Africa. One is the cultural traditions that are embedded in many African societies. Many of these tribal and ethnic groups that we talked about have one thing in common, and that is that your status in the community is linked to your ability to bear children. Before the 20th century, women felt that they had to have a lot of children because very few of their children would live to adulthood. And so if they had many children, then, and half of them died as children, never made it to adulthood, they could still have 7 or 8 kids by the time that would grow on to adulthood, and that would ensure their status in the community. And even though nowadays you have much lower infant mortality in Africa, the cultural traditions die very hard, and that mentality and the focus on bearing as many children as you can have still remains in much of the rural population in Africa. Another reason for this is because in Africa you don't have a lot of retirement options. You don't see nursing homes, you don't see retirement communities like you do here. Children are your retirement plan. They are expected to care for their parents as they get older. And then overall, there's generally negative views towards birth control. Many are very suspicious of it and very hesitant to use it. And in some cases, it just is a lack of access to birth control as well. So what you're going to start to see as a result is a growing urban population. Now, in the United States, our cities tend to be very productive centers of commerce. That's where you have a lot of businesses, a lot of headquarters for companies. A lot of jobs happen in cities or kind of stem from cities and they're headquartered in cities. But it's very different in a lot of these decolonized, or what we've taken to calling third world nations. The cities are actually parasitic, meaning that they are basically leeching on to the rest of the country and relying on the rest of the country to provide them with the necessities that they need to survive. There aren't really a lot of job opportunities in cities. People flock to cities thinking that they will get jobs, but those jobs are taken very quickly. And so what you end up having in many of these developing and underdeveloped nations will be large swaths of the city taken over by slums, where you have unemployed families living in shacks, in makeshift shelters, oftentimes near a city dump where they can get scrap metal, scrap wood, and they are dependent for any food and sustenance on the rural agriculture to survive. Now, you've got to remember, most of these developing countries have very little manufacturing. So there is some manufacturing in cities, but only a few city dwellers have those jobs. They're taken up very quickly. So most of the people in developing nations that are actually producing are going to be in the rural areas. The problem is the rural areas are now plagued with such a high demand to produce because of overpopulation. They've got to feed a lot of people, a growing population. So rather than practicing positive, sustainable agricultural methods, the farmers are just going to overfarm every year until the soil is depleted, the nutrients are gone, erosion takes over, and you see a host of environmental problems like deforestation in the developing world today. Women in the post-colonial era are going to see some development. In most countries, women will be given voting rights, but women in politics remain the exception. The three women you see here were leaders, were in politics in their respective countries, but they were often well connected with leading families in those countries. So you don't often see women rising from the bottom or even the middle class to participate in politics. For most women in post-colonial society, you're going to see development in family rights and women's rights lagging behind the West. In many of these nations, there's still early marriage, the expectation to have large families, and very little education provided to girls. In many countries, especially in the rural areas, the perception that women are subservient to males still exists. For example, the Indian tradition that women must serve husbands before eating, that has died very slowly, and in some areas has still not died, and it's still going on in some places. You tend to see a divide between rural customs and urban customs. Urban customs, in cities you tend to see more interaction with the Western world and Western traditions and Western thinking. So it tends to be a little bit more, women's rights tend to be a little bit farther along in cities. Oftentimes women have to bear the burden for shortage of resources available to the family. A lot of times it's not really the men who are making the daily decisions about how to get food on the table, how to get the kids dressed, whether or not to put them in school. So they share the majority of sort of the burden for the domestic responsibilities and the anxiety that comes as a result of that. Religious revivalism, or the rise of fundamentalism, throughout much of the Middle East will initiate a return to veiling and stoning. And you see this in areas controlled by ISIS, in areas that were controlled by the Taliban. You'll see in Afghanistan before before we went to war with Afghanistan in 2001, women had to wear the burqa and were subjected to very harsh punishments if they stepped out of line. In many of these post-colonial countries, you see two significant barriers to industrialization. First is a lack of training. There's not a lot of education available. Most education would be comparable to our middle school, high school, maybe high school level education, but there's not a lot of post-high school education available. And that is available is really only available to the wealthy or the upper middle class. So you don't have a lot of highly trained individuals. And the other aspect to this is the lack of capital or money needed to buy machines, to buy factories. You just don't have enough people in these countries that can afford to start a business. you don't even really have enough people that can afford to invest in starting a business. And remember, we talked about investing, and it's a way to partially own a business without having to bear the entire risk. However, you really can only have investment when people are making more than they need to survive. In most of these post-colonial nations, people are barely surviving, and thus they don't really have anything left over to invest in building new industries. So what we're left with is the fact that these post-colonial, or they're sometimes called neo-colonial nations, are still providing primary products or raw materials for manufactured goods. The reason we call them neo-colonial, and neo is a word that basically means new, colonial. It's a new form of colonialism or colonization in which they're not politically controlled by another country, but they are still economically controlled by another country. They are still easily taken advantage of. Their economies are easily manipulated by the more powerful Western nations. We've seen this in Latin America. We talked about that in chapter 23. You see this in Africa and in many parts of Asia as well. Some of the most common primary products that we're going to be getting from Africa are going to be cocoa, palm oil, coffee, copper, oil, and bauxite. The prices will decrease for these products over time, oftentimes just because the supply outpaces demand. They're producing way more coffee than the Western world really needs. And at the same time, prices for manufactured goods are rising. So people living in Africa are not making as much, but they're having to pay a lot more if they want manufactured goods from the West. Another issue that we have related to the economy is that in many of these governments, you see corruption, you see a lot of bribery, you see a lot of backdoor agreements between companies. And a lot of times the aid that is offered to the post-colonial or developing nations doesn't always get to the people. Social reform is not happening very quickly in these nations either. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are two international organizations set up to provide loans to developing economies. But a lot of times when an industrialized nation makes a loan to a developing economy, they require that country buy their products. So basically, if the United States were to make a loan or to loan money to Sudan, they could require that the Sudanese buy certain American-made products. This, in a sense, it basically gives the United States a monopoly in Sudan and limits the amount of choice, the amount of competition that the Sudanese people are able to bring in. Loans from International Bank often come with requirements to reduce government subsidies for the poor. So sometimes when international banks make loans, it actually has a detrimental effect on the economy overall because the poor are not getting the subsidies that they need for food, for medical care, and other necessities. You often see throughout the post-colonial regions of the world that state building or nation building has been a very slow, very tense process. And this is a map that shows you all of the various conflicts that have gone on in Africa since Africa decolonized in the 1960s and 70s. A lot of instability, and a lot of times this results from the different ethnic groups living in close proximity, vying for power, and not being able to work out compromises, oftentimes due to lack of political experience or corruption in the government. So a couple examples. In Ghana, you have a powerful leader, Kwame Nkrumah, who led the independence movement in Ghana, but as he starts to see tensions and hotspots developing within his country, he starts to become increasingly authoritarian. Now, we've talked about in the past how authoritarianism is often bred in areas where you have a poor economy, you have the threat of uprising, and leaders will often use those fears and those problems as an excuse to do away with all democratic institutions and exert total control. That's exactly what Hitler did in Germany. Nkrumah becomes very authoritarian and starts to lean toward a more communist model, starts to communicate more with some of the communist countries in the East. And of course, the communist world is trying to recruit countries over to their ideology, just like we in the West are trying to recruit countries over to our ideology. What this does, however, is that it will alienate his country from the West. When we start to see that Nkrumah is leaning towards communism, a lot of prosperous nations in Western Europe and in the United States are going to cut off loans or other forms of aid to Ghana. The Convention People's Party, which is his party, will quickly become a communist party. It will suppress opposition. We see that in communist nations throughout the world. But in 1966, Nkrumah's enemies stage a coup and oust him. However, instead of establishing a free democratic government, Ghana goes to the opposite extreme and becomes a military dictatorship, much like a fascist state. So we go from the extreme left to the extreme right in Ghana. And unfortunately, Ghana is not unique. What we see throughout the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, in a lot of these developing nations is basically a retreat to the extremes. You've got one side, communism, the other side, military dictatorship. The United States, when brought into these and trying to solve some of these issues, is forced to choose between the leftist extreme or the rightist extreme. Now, the only thing we hate more than fascism is communism. So, the Western countries tend to support military dictatorships over communist regimes. So a lot of times the United States will give aid, either monetary aid, aid in the form of weapons, sometimes aid in the form of troops, but we will provide aid to groups that are seeking to unseat communists and install military dictatorships. But in the end, still an authoritarian regime. So you're not really winning on either side of this issue. A large amount of spending in these military dictatorships will go to weapons development. So in the military dictatorships that are established throughout Africa, a lot of their budget goes to weapons development, doesn't get to the people, doesn't go to funding businesses or giving tax breaks to entrepreneurs. Those are the types of things that you need to do if you want to have a healthy economy. You need to incentivize business development. But money isn't going to that. Money is going to weapons development, and it's oftentimes lining the pockets of very corrupt and soon to be very wealthy military leaders. Egypt is another example of this. Now, we talked about the Khedives way back in Unit 4. The Khedives, remember, were basically a puppet government in Egypt. Because Britain had invested so heavily in Egypt and in the Suez Canal specifically, Britain kind of controlled Egypt through their puppets, the Khedives. But the Khedives had, by the 1950s, become very corrupt and very wealthy. The Free Officers movement will arise in opposition to this corruption, and it will ally with another group called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is still around today, often accused of many terrorist activities in the region. The Khedive regime will be toppled in 1952, and Egypt will be led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who basically sells himself as a reformist dictator. He's a dictator, but he's going to reform Egypt. So, a few of the things he does to reform. First, he promotes land reform, redistribution of the land. He also promotes state-financed education. He creates some government jobs and provides subsidies to help lower food prices, giving out subsidies to farmers so they don't have to charge as much for food. A big thing that Nasser is known for is kicking the British out of the Suez Canal. Now, ever since the Suez Canal was built, the British and the French had invested heavily in this canal, and because of their investment, they, and particularly the British, felt that they had the right to control the canal. Nasser says, no more. We're going to take control. It's our canal. This is in our country. British, you're done. The United States and the Soviets actually support Nasser. This sends a very strong message to Britain. Basically, the United States says, hey, Britain, you are no longer top dog anymore. You can't just go into a region and take what you want anymore. You have been unseated, your empire has fallen, and you need to allow the Egyptians to take back their canal, which they do. The next thing that Nasser does is to initiate the Aswan Dam project. He believes will cause much greater productivity, agricultural productivity in the region, but it has a lot of negative side effects. It actually leads to a decline in agricultural fertility, and because it creates a lot of swampy land nearby, it leads to a rise of parasites, and a particular parasite that causes blindness. Many of Nasser's other reform projects will fail due to inadequate funding. You also see uncontrolled population growth as well. Anwar Sadat will be the next leader in Egypt. He will privatize a lot of state-run industries. That means that's basically the opposite of what communism does. You know how communism takes things and takes private industry and collectivizes it? We talked about that under Stalin's 5-year plans and the collectivization. Privatization takes state-run businesses and allows individuals and corporations to own them without the interference of the government. He will also end the stalemate in Israel, and at this point, Egypt will express support for the nation of Israel and become a key ally, which is important because they are a Muslim nation. He will, however, provide support for other revolutionary movements in the Arab world, and he will open Egypt up to more investment from the United States and Europe. Hosni Mubarak will take over from Anwar Sadat. He will continue the movement towards capitalism, because after all, privatization is a process that only occurs in capitalist or capitalist-leaning societies. However, his government is plagued with corruption. The population increase continues. This leads to poverty, unemployment, and a growing sense of discontent. Now again, the theme is when you see a lot of discontent in society, you often end up with extremist movements. And that is what we'll see. By 2011, the people of Egypt will stage a revolution. This is often considered the first revolution that was brought about by social media, like Facebook, brought people into the streets to oust Hosni Mubarak. And since then, Egypt has been through a series of governments and is still working to promote stability in the country. In India, we're going to see a slightly different track. Now, they definitely have high population growth, and they definitely have state intervention in the economy, very similar to Egypt. However, one thing that makes India's government very different from a lot of the governments in Africa is that it is committed to secular, civilian, democratic rule, meaning that the government has a strong separation of church and state. It's committed to democracy. Voting rights are preserved. They have encouraged private investment within of Indians themselves. They've encouraged Indians to start investing in their own country and building businesses in their own country. A lot of times governments can encourage investment by giving tax breaks to new businesses. They've also encouraged foreign investment. So combined, foreign and private investment has helped India to become a very prosperous country in the past few decades. Now, there's still, of course, a high wage gap, a lot of economic disparity between the rich and the poor, but India is a rapidly growing economy. One thing that helped India's growth was a phase called the Green Revolution. This was a focus on science in agriculture. India promoted a lot of its scientists to be studying ways to improve seeds, ways to improve fertilizers, basically ways to do agriculture better so you could, work less but gain higher crop yields to be more efficient. This will help Indian agriculture to thrive, and it will then allow India to feed its soaring population. Also in India, because of the private and foreign investment, they have a lot of money going into high-tech sectors. You see a lot of software development firms in India. A lot of outsourcing is going to India. Call centers all throughout India are opening up for American companies, but they are providing jobs throughout the country, which is fueling the economy overall. Wealth disparity, as I said, does continue. You have a very poor class in India, a very wealthy class in India, but one trend that you do see is a growing middle class. So hopefully that trend will continue and more of the poor will join the middle class in years to come. In Iran, after World War II, Iran will achieve its independence. It will become a modernized and westernized country under the Pahlavi Shahs, a ruling family in Iran. Overall, however, the middle class is hurt by a lot of the economic development here. You'll start to see the Shahs showing much more favoritism to the wealthy, much more advantages going to the wealthy. Another trend happening in Iran post-World War II is that Iran becomes increasingly secular. People start to fall away from the traditional values of Islam. They start to dress like Westerners, act like Westerners, and some in Iran find that problematic. So an opposition movement begins to grow by the 1970s. This movement grows among many in Iran who are worried about the gradual secularization of the country. And in 1978, this opposition movement has grown so large that they actually have recruited many supporters among the army. The army actually refuses to back the Shah in 1978, and the Pahlavi Shah will be overthrown and exiled in 1979. Now this is a massive blow to the United States, who supported the Shahs, because after all, they were westernized. We did a lot of trade with that country. And since 1979, Iran has become an increasingly restrictive fundamentalist regime. In fact, at this time, this is when the Iran hostage crisis took place in 1979, and several of our diplomats were held hostage in the embassy for several months, until actually the day Reagan was inaugurated was also the day they were released. Ayatollah Khomeini takes over in Iran with the revolution of 1979. He promises to purify Iran from what he calls satanic Western influences. And this is really indicative of what a lot of fundamentalist Muslims believe, and what's fueling a lot of the fundamentalist movements in the Middle East through the 90s and to today. They believe that there's been too much westernization, too much influence from the United States. Hollywood is corrupting the youth. The modern music, modern values have corrupted the pure values of the Quran, or at least the values of the Quran as they interpret it. And the fundamentalists throughout the Arab world today are pledging to bring back what they see as the pure values of Islam. Now, of course, many Muslims around the world say, that's not Islam, this is not what we teach. But according to Khomeini and other fundamentalists, it's the West that needs to be pushed out and Western ideas that need to be eradicated. Khomeini does oppose communism. He merges politics and religion, and remember, we call this Sharia law. He implements Sharia law into Iran. Women lose rights, and this is a society where you will see veiling and stoning becoming common once again, so hearkening back to the Abbasid days of Persia. In the 1980s, we have a conflict between Iran and its neighbor Iraq. Saddam Hussein, the leader of neighboring Iraq, takes advantage of the instability in Iran to invade the western provinces of Iran. Now, these western provinces here have a lot of oil, and Saddam Hussein, of course, would like to have access to that oil. But Iran's resources have been drained. Its weapons are inferior to Iraq's. Khomeini declares an armistice in 1988, and Iran is basically drained of resources and lacking in development. Moving on to South Africa. This is the richest and most populous country in Africa. The white Afrikaners, or the Dutch, or descendants of the Dutch, if you remember, the Boers, they will form the Nationalist Party. And post-World War II, South Africa basically functioned as an independent state, but it wasn't until 1980 that they won complete official independence from Great Britain. With this independence, they established a very harsh system of apartheid, or extreme segregation. This keeps the black Africans in the homelands, or the poorest regions of the country. There's a lot of overcrowding, poverty, very few jobs. Any jobs that are provided to the black Africans are basically in cities. They're menial labor, they're very low paid, very few rights for workers. And they have no voting rights. The black Africans have no voting rights, no ability to participate in politics. So what you see here in South Africa is a society that very much mirrors the Jim Crow South in our own country. Well, years of oppression are going to cause movements to arise to make a change. But it's going to take a while. The any attempts at black organization and black protest is brutally repressed by the white police forces. The African National Congress is declared illegal. Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, who are two of the major leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, will be jailed. Steve Biko, another leader, will be murdered while in police custody. No one questions that. And so you see a lot of the major leaders of the movement jailed for many, many years. Thus, the movement against apartheid does not move forward very quickly. But it is still simmering under the surface. The nationalists are seeking to play up on existing ethnic rivalries between tribal groups. So basically, kind of doing much of what the Europeans have done for many years when they colonized and controlled Africa. If you can get the tribal groups to fight one another, they're not going to be fighting you. However, hostility does continue to grow between the blacks, who make up the majority population in South Africa, and the white Afrikaners, who are the minority. The economy is drained due to boycotts. As more and more of the Western world catches on to what is going on here in South Africa, you see, even in the United States, a push to boycott South African goods. So a lot of human rights activists across Western countries are getting out the word on apartheid, and as more and more people around the world refuse to buy South African exports, South Africa's economy is starting to feel the pain. They also start to feel the pain as they engage in conflicts with nearby Namibia and Angola. So slowly, because of the economic pressure and the pressure of Western nations, the system of apartheid will be dismantled. A white politician, F.W. de Klerk, will come to power and convince the government to free black political prisoners, like Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, now free, will lead a movement for the enfranchisement of blacks, or giving voting rights to the black Africans. Now, this is a smart move because the black Africans make up the majority of the population in South Africa. He knows that if they are given the right to vote, that they will vote in change. And once they are given the right to vote, and again, much of this comes due to international pressure, they vote Mandela as their president, and he becomes the nation's first black president. Now, I would like to say that they have since achieved a pluralist democracy where everybody lives peacefully side by side, but you still see a lot of interethnic rivalries. There are still many white supremacist groups in South Africa. Unfortunately, we do see the same thing in this country here today. So it's, racism is something that does not die quickly. It can remain sort of simmering underneath the surface and be brought to the surface when certain events are kind of all come into collusion at the same time. So that gives you an overview of some of the emerging nations throughout the latter half of the 20th century. What I would like you to do now is, on a sheet of scrap paper, and there is no room for this in your notes, compare the two nations that we discussed today and fill in a Venn diagram on a sheet of scrap paper to and be prepared to share this with the class.